How you folks doing? Yeah. Friday night. Thank you for sharing part of your Friday night. I understand that I stand between you and happy hour. I take that very seriously. I won't abuse the time. But I do appreciate this opportunity to be here, to speak with you, to visit with you folks for a little while, and to tell a few stories about where I come from. It's a beautiful place. It's not one of those sympathetic places. It's not poverty porn. It's a beautiful place, one of the most beautiful places in the world. I'm honored to be here at the National Association of Independent Schools, the People of Color Conference. Give me a round of applause for people of color. I love the title, Art, Science, Soul, and the Equity in Paris. I can almost, when I hear soul, I can almost hear Don Cornelius. Yeah. I want to extend a special thank you to the People of Color Conference, to all you folks for being here, for giving up part of your happy hour, to you folks for engaging me in conversation throughout the week. I've had great conversations throughout the week. I want to thank Miss Carolyn G. Blackwell. Please stand. There you are. You said front and center. I didn't know exactly, that really meant front and center. Black feet people, my folks have a kind of slightly skewed sense of direction, so yeah, there you go. Thank you for the opportunity. It's a wonderful opportunity to be here. It's an honor. You're so gracious and kind. And she also feeds, by the way. She had food in her room last night. And I'm one of those people, I'll go to weird places for food. Not saying your room is a weird place. I've shown at some odd places for food. So thank you very much for that. I also want to mention, give explicit gratitude to Brother Eddie Moore. Is Brother Eddie Moore here? And the White Privilege Conference. That's sort of, yeah, white privilege. If you folks haven't had the opportunity to go, I truly recommend that you go. It's a great opportunity to have conversations about how white privilege, this very insidious, amorphous thing, really seeps its way into places that you wouldn't necessarily assume. And they take on those conversations head on. I think the conference this year is in Philadelphia. So we know. That's right, Fresh Prince. And so white privilege, and speaking of privilege, it's a privilege to be here. It's a nice segue. I've had amazing conversations, and I was learning about applications of complex problems to current day situations and how it affects the classroom, the administration of education within private schools, independent schools. And it's a world that I didn't know because I grew up in public schools. So this is an amazing eye-opening experience, and I thank you all for sharing your expertise with me. You folks are the teachers, and you've certainly been teaching me. I had the opportunity to speak to Amir and Daniel and Akeem and David about the role that history plays in schools today. And it's a very, very profound role, and we'll talk about that shortly. But you'll notice that the title was switched substantially because we've just been talking about history. Talking about history, how history affects right now. Sometimes as Americans, we're consumers. So we're taught that we consume history. It was a moment in time, and it has no longer importance today. And I submit that our missions as educators, as communicators, as facilitators will be better if we understand the role of history in our work today. History matters. 3 housekeeping matters. Number 1, I will be having a book signing for my book, How to Say I Love You in Indian, immediately afterwards, right? And that will take place down by the registration desk. Number 2, housekeeping matters. I went to the Native Affinity Group, and thank you very much, Native Affinity Group, wherever you folks are, for the opportunity. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, give Carol, the rest of the crew a round of applause. And there was folks. I feel like Arsenio Hall, there was an episode of Arsenio Hall, the clip gets shined sometimes. He says, do not adjust your televisions. I'm black. And I feel like that anytime I get these opportunities to address largely non-native crowds, no, native people are still here. Native people are still here. And it's, I submit, part of our responsibility to find those native folks, whether as educators or students, and bring them here. So that's part of my challenge to all of you folks. Find some people and bring them here. Entertain our conversation. It was a good moment at the affinity group, but I also realized that we're all poorer to the degree that those voices are not heard. There's valuable perspective there. And in the same way that it would be something that would be profoundly missing if black folks weren't in the room, or Hispanic brothers and sisters, or Arab brothers and sisters. There's something that's profoundly missing when native people, the original people of this land, are not part of those conversations. Finally, last housekeeping matter, I have a challenge to my white brothers and sisters who are in the audience. And I'm going to start that with a story. I was very fortunate to go to Columbia Law School in New York City. And for 2 of the years that I was at Columbia Law School in New York City, I was the only native person there. Excuse me, I was one of 2 native people there. There was one other woman that was there, a young lady. And very often, whenever there was a conversation about native anything, I was the default expert. Anytime there was a conversation about native law, everybody turned to me. Anytime there was a question about native rights, everybody turned to me. There was a question about Jeep Cherokee, everybody turned to me. Going to these schools, folks, and this is specifically to my white brothers and sisters, is oftentimes a very isolating experience. You oftentimes feel very, very alone. And when you are a student of color at a predominantly white school, you feel like the whole world is a white shirt, and you're a white or a brown or a black spot on it. And I encourage you, all of my white brothers and sisters, at this conference and conferences like this, to use this as an opportunity to increase your empathy about what it feels like to be the vast minority, to be that spot, to feel like, well, this thing isn't quite for you. Yeah, that's okay, you can do that. I highly recommend, because I see little clusters of 3 and 4 white educators walking around, and I highly suggest, because our students that go to these schools don't have that opportunity to bring 3 or 4 other brown folks from the hood with them to these schools. I suggest you break out of that comfort zone, increase that empathy just a little bit. As I want to talk about history today. It's going to be a little bit of a history lesson. It's going to be about a history lesson about folks that you don't normally hear from. But first, we're going to start with another story. And this story is actually called Harvard. And it's a story in the form of a poem. And it's about some of the folks that you may or may not serve. And it starts like this. Scene. An Indian student in the classroom, sitting quietly at his desk, filling out his application to Harvard with a pen, writing and dreaming big dreams of success. 12th grade teacher stands in the back of the room, arms crossed, head down in distress. Silence for half an hour before the professor began to profess. Clear the throat. Manuel, I've given this a lot of thought. Are you sure you want to go through with this? You're applying to a school with literally only a few spots, divided amongst hundreds of thousands of applicants. Do you really think you have a shot? Her question suggested her answer. She thought that this was all for naught. Plus, she wanted to leave the school before 5 o'clock. She didn't think that he could make it, despite the lessons that she herself taught. despite his work ethic and perseverance that she seems to have forgotten. Manny was familiar with the statistics. He has heard them quite a lot. People telling him no since he was little. He was well aware that Harvard was a long shot. Hell, he was a long shot. He wasn't supposed to be here. Public education was a crime, but he was here. He thought again about her question, smiled at her, and answered her, "Can I make it?" "Sure, why not?" She exhaled loudly, cut her eyes. "Fine, but please finish up soon. I have a lot of students' homework to grade this afternoon." "Manny, how would you even pay for such a school? You weren't born with a silver spoon. Your mom makes minimum wage, your dad's long gone, he brought the local greasy spoon. Even if your solid grades and personal statements make the admission committee swoon, would you even be able to go?" Manny had a pretty good idea of what his teacher thought. He grinned at her and answered her, "Thank you so much for that food for thought, but I don't worry about the school saying no. My mom had nothing. Having less than nothing does not mean a whole lot. She would have loved a rejection letter from an Ivy League school, some little sign that Indian people weren't completely forgot. That rejection letter is a sign of progress. If that's the worst prospect that I've got, then I'm doing pretty good, dear teacher. Indian kids ain't supposed to have squat. Especially when we're raised by single parents. We're not even supposed to have a piss-filled pot, but I have my people, my mom, and soon a diploma. I'd say that I have quite a lot. Plus the audacity to expect more than just a menial job or pre-hot to the cot. I demand more on behalf of all my people who wanted to dream but simply could not. They were starving, stolen from their parents, sick, and or simply trying not to get shot. My life isn't ideal, but I don't have any of those worries. So even if I don't get one of those coveted Harvard slots, I promise I'll be plotting how to make even more opportunity. So I thank you for staying with me past 5 o'clock. Folks, Western white schools, and let's make absolutely no mistake about it, this Western model of education that we're all here for is 100% unquestionably white. These schools have historically not been good places. They have not been healthy places, to use the term of art that everybody seems to be using. They have not been generative places for Native people to learn. We're going to talk about a few things today. First and foremost, I'm going to talk about my folks today. I want to talk about Native people for a little bit today because you rarely get to hear about us and you damn sure don't get to hear from us. And so we're going to do that today. Now, statistically, this is true. Think about this for a second. This might be the last time that you hear from a Native person face to face. That's true in this United States. And so, damn it, you should listen. So first and foremost, we're going to talk about Native people, but we're also going to talk about history and the way that history affects us today. It profoundly and deeply affects us. And finally, we're going to talk about circles. What circles, Karen? We're going to talk about the effects that circles have on us, and mice. And we're going to do a conversation about what to do today in our schools and classrooms, today understanding how deeply and profoundly this history affects us today to embolden, this is important, to embolden and empower our students to reflect the power that history has on us today, and hopefully to make a better tomorrow. But first, we're going to talk about us. First fact about Native people, the reports of Native people demise have been grossly exaggerated. Yes, police kill us at higher rates than anybody else empirically in these United States. Yes, we have the shortest lifespans of anybody on this continent. Yes, this is true according to the Department of Justice. 1 in 3 Native women will be the victim of rape during her lifetime. 3 out of those 5 perpetrators of those rapes will be non-Native men. Moreover, the Department of Justice will decline to prosecute 70% of those cases. All of that is absolutely 100% empirically true, but we're still here. And we're still around. and we're still kicking. And in some places, we're still thriving, according to both story, anecdote, as well as empirical study. Even in this particular area, it's now called Tampa Bay, which many would not see as a quote-unquote Indian place, a native land. This is the Aboriginal homelands of the Tocobaga people, as well as the Calusa native people. Later in the 1700s, the area became a home to the Seminole people, who still are around here and adapting and acclimating to changes, just as our native people have done for tens of thousands of years. That's what we do, acclimate, adapt, change. Much of that adaptation and acclimation in recent centuries came as the result of necessity, specifically surrounding school. And we'll talk about that shortly. And it became that way because of violence within those schools, because of white supremacy within those schools, and we'll also touch on those briefly. The good Dr. Martin Luther King said, "Our nation was born in genocide when it embraced the doctrine that the original American, the Indian, was an inferior race. Even before there were large numbers of Negroes on our shore, the scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society. From the 16th century forward, blood flowed in battles of racial supremacy. We are perhaps the only nation which tried as a matter of national policy to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated that tragic experience into a noble crusade. Indeed, even today, we have not permitted ourselves to reject or feel remorse for this shameful episode. Our literature, our films, our drama, our folklore all exalt it. Very importantly, the elder Martin Luther King Jr. continued on. He said, "Our children are taught to respect the violence which reduced a red-skinned people of an earlier culture into a few fragmented groups herded into impoverished reservations. Our children are still taught to respect the violence which reduced the red-skinned people of an earlier culture into a few fragmented groups herded into impoverished reservations." How are our children taught to respect violence against Native people? Firstly, there is violence by omission against Native people. In a book called Lies, My Teacher Told Me About Christopher Columbus, What Your History Books Got Wrong, by a man named James Lowen, he quantified what a lot of us Native people intuitively know or suspect, that history books that all of you folks and all of your schools teach from erase Native people out of the narrative, habitually, consistently, systemically, as a matter of empirical fact. So Mr. Lowen reduced that suspicion into a matter of empirical fact. He said, there's a book called A History of the United States by Daniel Borstead and Brooks Mather Kelly. And his book, which he said devotes the largest amount of space to the story of Columbus's voyage to what he called the New World, this book devotes 2,000 words to the voyage to the New World. And out of the 2,000 words, it actually devotes 5 words to Native people. And the natives called it, and I don't want to mess up the pronunciation because it's important, this is one of the 5 words that we get. The natives called it Guanahani. That's us, that's all of our story in this book. Empirically, data-driven. But not only are natives omitted from the text, but we are also omitted from the pomp and circumstance that we see in Columbus's name today. This guy, he must have been special. He even gets a name. And there's no larger conversation within many schools about this guy named Christopher Columbus. these 5 words. Well, what about those people who called it Guanahani? What happened to them afterwards? Did he interact lovingly with these people who called it Guanahani? They didn't even say who they were. They called this place Guanahani. We gloss over genocide. We don't mention genocide. Not only do we gloss over genocide, but we actually celebrate genocide. After all, it was Christopher Columbus who said in his own words. They are very simple, speaking of Native people, they're very simple and honest and exceedingly liberal with all they have. None of them refusing anything he may possess when he is asked for it. They exhibit great love toward all others in preference over themselves. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and do whatever we want. And we all know what happened. Yet there is no explanation in any of these books that Mr. Lowen covered. And when a child discovers this, can you imagine the effect of this on a Native child? This doesn't sound like that nice of a guy. Yet obviously he must be great because we devote 2,000 words to him in our textbook and none to me. We have a day off for this guy and none for me. This is violence by omission. Secondly, there is violence by commission. The images that schools do allow and see of Native people are oftentimes mocking, oftentimes confusing. So once again, we hear a bit about the story of Thanksgiving and see natives as these docile pacifists who must have given up their land because there's no mention of the invariable warfare that happened. And they must have gave up that land in the same way they so willingly gave up their food for that first Thanksgiving. There is never any conquest. There's never any context. And another image that we see in schools of Native people with no context, of course, is mascots. You folks are familiar with the conversation around Native mascots, right? It's a question. You folks are familiar with this? Yes. Now, I'm not one of those folks who say that it's never right or that it's never wrong. I think that there's nuance within this conversation, but I'm going to give you an example of that nuance. I come from a place called the Blackfeet Indian Reservation. It's 1.8 million acres, and on this beautiful place, there's a whole bunch of very, very tall, very, very good-looking, and very, very modest Native people there. It's about 98% Native. And so when it was an honor to actually play for the high school, which was called Browning High School, we were the Browning Indians. And when we would go to one of these outside all-white towns, because that's what happens in Montana, you understand why you're the Browning Indians, because whether or not it says so on your jersey, you're those damn Browning Indians. And it makes sense. Does that make sense? The context makes sense because it's 98% us deciding as a matter of volition, voice, self-determination who we want to be. And then when I moved to the city, I went to this school and the mascot was the Warriors. And there was this Asian kid who played the mascot and he had the big, stupid headdress on. And I was wondering, in this school where I barely saw me, except for if I looked in the mirror, no other Native students, why are all these people acting like they're Indians and doing a bad job of it? Why, when I go to the basketball games, because I played sports, are they doing that little stupid tomahawk chop thing? Why are they doing this? I don't understand this. There was no context for it. It didn't make any sense. Finally, I went to a school in college, one of the 6 colleges I went to. I was on a serious Indian route, the native path to higher education. And I went to a school called Haskell Indian Nations University. And obviously, just the name itself tells you this was for Native people. This was us exercising our voice. And we were the Haskell Indians because we love being Indians at Haskell. We love doing Indian stuff. And once again, the context made sense. My point with this, of course, is that context is everything. I can't say when it's always bad. I can't say that it's always good, but there's this matter of consent. Consent. And when there is no context, such assertions amount to it stealing a taking of our imagery, of our cultural items, our cultural patrimony, with no consent. These non-Native people and schools that do it with absolutely no Native voice are stealing our imagery without asking us. The context doesn't make sense. I see my brother over here with the Caucasian t-shirt. Yeah, how you doing, Awan? Yeah, man. But that's just symbolic violence, right? Mascots and by omission. That's not real violence in an educational setting. Well, I submit that there's a history of real physical violence which Native people directly associate with schools. So Manny, remember Manny in the poem? There's a history of violence that Manny associates with schools when he's applying to these schools, and I'm going to talk about that. There was this thing called boarding schools. And we're not talking about any of these fancy boarding schools. We're not talking about $40,000 tuition. We're talking about a guy named Colonel Henry Pratt, who was the head of Indian education. And his bona fides to be the head of Indian education was that he was a former colonel in the army that kept prisoners of war secure. And he said, you seem like you're pretty qualified to educate Native people. And he created this policy. And this was the official United States policy on education for Native people. We are going to kill the Indian and save the man. We are going to kill the Indian and save the man. And if you think about the insidiousness, the ugliness of that statement, man and Indian cannot coexist. One has to go away. He said that he wanted to transfer the savage-born infant to the surroundings of civilization, and he will grow to possess a civilized language and habit. Now, this policy grew out of an economic model. There was initially a policy called extermination, where they said, well, we just want to kill all these Indian people because they're called the Indian problem. We have to do something with them. And this guy, he had a mathematical equation. He said, you know what it costs to kill every single Indian in the United States, to sustain a war for 8 years against Native people? It will cost $22 million. He said, but it only costs $1,800 to educate a Native student for 18 years. So he said it would be more cost effective to educate them than to kill them. And so this guy, Colonel Henry Pratt, said, okay, cool. And that's what they did. They started stealing, literally stealing Native children. And in fact, over 100,000 Native children were stolen from their parents, oftentimes at the end of a gun. And there wasn't this submissive Native parent that said, oh, okay, well, you got me. You're taking my kids. Across the nation, there was this hide-and-seek game where Native parents taught their kids to hide whenever they saw white people coming. Fear. They taught them to hide whenever they saw white people coming, because they're coming to steal you. And when there was resistance, physical resistance to the stealing of these Native children, for example, there was a group of 19 Hopi Native people from the Southwest who said, no, hell no, you're not taking our kids. They went to Alcatraz. They got a one-way ticket to Alcatraz, to the prison, the military prison, and said, that is the cost for resisting United States authority of education. And here's the punchline, the kids still went to boarding school. Once they got to school, they literally tried to kill the Indian and save the man. They beat the Indian out of those Native kids. They washed their mouths out with soap anytime they spoke the only tongue they knew, which was their native tongue. There was these beatings. There was this small matter when they arrived at the school, they were stripped down because they were dirty Indians. They were stripped down, and these folks, these agents, used DDT or kerosene or alcohol to wash them off, to scrub them. They said, we're going to kill the Indian and save the man. And there was other types of violence in school. As a matter of empirical record, there was massive sexual abuse. And the lawsuits are still being settled from that time period. But I suppose the point is this. That's not just symbolic violence. That's real violence. And those Native kids weren't protected. They were stolen at the end of the gun, and they were told that their ways have no value, and that everything that they've ever learned up until that point was evil, that their parents were evil, that their grandparents were evil, and that their parents were going to hell. And there was no separation of church and state. There was no separation of church and state. My grandpa, his name was Percy Bullchild. He was a medicine bundle holder for my folks, Scott people, Gunny people, the Southern Pagan, the Blackfeet people. And he wrote a book about our creation stories. He wasn't an educated man. He ran away from boarding school, one of these boarding schools in 6th grade. And the book, however, because it had such compelling medicine in it, such amazing stories, it went to Harper and Collins. That's a big deal for this dropout in elementary school. He hated education. Think about if he had cultivated that writing ability. If he had cultivated that learning, that formal Western learning, but the images that he had of Western learning were that of sexual abuse, of physical abuse, of being dipped in alcohol and DDT and kerosene. And so he hated school. And he hated school for his kids. And he said, you know what I'm saying, you guys ain't going to school. And that was 2 generations ago. He wrote several books, but he was hampered by broken English. Think about the books he could have written if he did not have the trauma with school. There could be a native who cured cancer using echinacea, which is indigenous to our homelands. But that native kid's parents were traumatized by sexual abuse from being stolen from their parents and being sexually abused. And that hatred, that trauma, and that abuse still manifests itself today. Today, as a matter of fact, Native youth post the worst achievement scores and the lowest graduation rates of any student subgroup. From Education Week, they say that about 50%, half of Native students graduate from high school. For comparison, graduation rates for Latinos have reached 68%. That's good. For the rates for Black students is now at 62%. All of those rates are increasing. The college graduation rates for Native students is 23%. So 23% compared to 59% for Asians, whites with 43%, and Black folks with 27%. We're still not performing in school. History counts. Like my parents with my grandpa, who was traumatized by these nasty racist abuses and racist schools, as a matter of historical record, they were doomed to hate school before they were even born. They had no guidance otherwise. And we all need guidance. Which brings me to circles. See, there was a study that was done by a guy named Jan Sohmann. Jan Sohmann is this German guy who wanted to determine if people could walk in straight lines. Don't ask me why he wanted to study that. White people with money study weird stuff. But he wanted to test, could people walk in a straight line? And so what he did is he dropped a group of people in the Sahara Desert at nighttime. He dropped a group of people in the forest at nighttime and said, walk in a straight line. And it was kind of compelled by this anecdote that says most people, when they go hiking, they always end up within a mile. When they die, they find them within a mile of where they started from. And he said, no, that can't be true, so I'm going to test this. And he tested them at nighttime, and you know what they did? They went in a circle. And he said, nah, that can't be true. Maybe they got like one leg shorter than the other, because they say everybody has one leg shorter than the other. So he said, well, we got to test against that, right? Make sure that they've got no cool walk that makes them walk in a circle. And he tested against that, and still, they walked in a circle. Then he said, well, let's put a blindfold on them. And we're going to do it over a shorter distance, 60 feet. And he tested them. And it invariably, to a person, walked in a circle. The conclusion from that: people who are walking, even when they have the best intentions in the world, even when they desperately want to walk in a straight line, without strong visual cues, without some form of assistance to help them navigate where they're going to end up right back where they started from. This is empirical. This is not me saying this. This is respectable white folks. This is German people. German people make Volkswagen. They make good stuff. And he said, with nothing to guide their way, people attempting to walk a straight course through unfamiliar territory really do end up walking in circles. And when I think of that, I think of Manny. I think of all of our students, our nieces and nephews, our children who don't have those strong visual cues. They go to these schools and they don't have any mentorship. They don't have any guidance. How do I get from point A to point B? Now listen, educators, diversity coordinator, you recruited me, but I don't know where I'm going. I'm supposed to walk in a straight line, but you're not giving me any strong visual cues. I'm that person walking in the forest, in the dark, and all you're doing is tracking whether or not I can end up back in the same spot. See, Manny, in this story, he understood history. He said, I demand more on behalf of all my people who wanted to dream but simply could not. They were starving, stolen from their parents, sick, and are simply trying not to get shot. He knew where history was, but that wasn't a visual cue. That was looking backwards. He wanted to figure out how to get forward, and there was nobody there to teach him that. There was another study. It was from a research team at New York's Mount Sinai Hospital, led by Rachel Yehuda. Yeah. And it stems from a genetic study of 32 Jewish men and women who had either been interned in a Nazi concentration camp, witnessed or experienced torture, or who had to hide during the Second World War. And they analyzed the genes of those children, of those folks who experienced that trauma. And they said that there was gene changes within those children, and those families grew up outside of Europe. And they said that those gene changes could only be attributed to Holocaust exposure in the parents. My point, specifically with Native people, history counts. This trauma that we experienced, that we associate with schools, that my grandpa hated because of the sexual abuse and the screaming within these schools, it transfers down. We must be willing to utilize the past to understand the present. In this particular instance, Native people's history with Western white educational institutions informs all Native people's access and willingness to go to school at all levels. It doesn't control it, but it informs it. It influences it. And that's true, obviously, for Native education, but it's also true for everybody else, folks. How do we know that? Because we see it in real time. We see a revolution happening right now. As James Baldwin said, there is a revolution now happening in the world. And that revolution is young folks paying attention to the way that history interfaces with the present. Up until this point, folks of all colors acted as if we were simply supposed to forget the past 500 years, and that it had no bearing on today. And most of the past social justice movements, if you think about it and study them, were largely about what was happening contemporaneously at that particular time. But now folks are beginning to look at past times and see how it affects today. For example, and I don't expect you folks to believe anything I say. I'm a lawyer by trade, by the way. So that means I lie for a living. That's the reason why I'm going to give you the sources, so you can look at it. It's Googleable. You can Google all this stuff. An example of that are the students at the University of Missouri. They created a powerful movement, understanding the illegitimate foundations of that institution. Since they cannot do anything about the past, there is at least the obligation to understand the past and acknowledge the past. You don't gloss over the past. They're using that knowledge of the past to make change. Institutional change. Because that's what it is. It's institutions who benefited from these very illegitimate structures in the past. Slavery. Well, there was the Missouri Compromise, right? You folks know this. Missouri Compromise, Kansas Free State, Missouri Slave State, and that actually started off the Civil War. And so the school that was built in 1851 necessarily had to be a slave state, and so that means that this structure, this place where we study at, was probably built with slave labor. There's institutional remedies in that instance. Well, it strikes me as fair that no black student should ever pay tuition Another example of how the past affects the present is in regards to land ownership and intergenerational wealth. I'm going to give you folks another Googleable statistic, and it says that white Americans own over 856 million acres of land. That represents over 98% of American land. Black Americans, as opposed to this 856 million acres, own how much? Anybody? 7 million acres. 7 million acres. And Native people, my folks, who had a decent amount of the property here, we own just 3 million acres of land collectively. Obviously, this harkens back to a time in very, very recent memory when black people and Native people could not, as a matter of legal fact, own land. And there was a massive land grab going on, like it's going on today with gentrification, right? So that's one connection to the present, but there's another one as well. I think of Ferguson, and I realize once again that history matters. After slavery, black folks were precluded from owning land, shared property. You folks know the story. Then, it became as a matter of de facto status because of restrictive land covenants in Missouri. And specifically, as a matter of fact, within the St. Louis area. And then there was this case in 1948, so 6 years before Brown v. Board of Education, that was called Shelley v. Kramer, that the United States Supreme Court ruled that racially restrictive covenants were unenforceable by law. That came out of St. Louis because they said, no, we still don't want these damn black folks living by us. And then there was another case called Jones v. Mayer in 1968 where the Supreme Court determined that the Mayer Company, which was a developer, they built a private subdivision in St. Louis and they were denying black families the ability to live there and to purchase a home. And they said, the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that solely on the basis of Mrs. Jones, the plaintiff in this case, her race. But that's how you start to see suburbs like Ferguson start to stack up. That's how you start to see these 80% black subdivisions, these 80% black suburbs in areas like St. Louis. And then finally, there was a case called, and I recommend you folks check this out, there was a case called United States versus City of Blackjack in 1974, where the 8th Court of Appeals took note that some of the zoning commissioners, so now it's moved from restrictive covenants to developers to zoning. And they said the zoning commissioners did take race into account. And they said that's unconstitutional under the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution. But the point is that this is a moving target. We're figuring out new and inventive ways to practice that same old white supremacy. very linear trajectory, descending directly from slavery to restrictive covenants to zoning, and now we have Ferguson, and we have Michael Brown, and we have those situations that are created as a result of this history. Point, once again, I have to conclude pretty soon. History matters. History matters. Come on, folks, say it with me. History matters. History matters. It's not just Native people. It's everybody. And you can choose to acknowledge its importance, or you can wait, my friends, till it's at your doorstep. Like at the University of Missouri, or like Ferguson, or like Baltimore. That's right. And that's good news, folks, that history can either be a tool of liberation, it can be a tool of prophecy. I can predict the future. That was not the last racial uprising that we're going to see. Or we can ignore it and it becomes an albatross. So, in closing, the question, how do we make history a tool of liberation within your schools, within our small communities that we live within? How do we show Manny and all of these beautiful students of color with no history of academic success, right? It's not an insult. I have no, once again, I went to 6 colleges. I did not have this strong visual cue. It's not my parents' fault. It's not their parents' fault. It's history. And we do something about it. We create those strong visual cues to help those children get out of the forest, to help them get out of the desert. Yeah. How do we do this and not be captive to history, but to learn from history? 3 things. Number 1, in regards to Manny and all of those Native students and many, many students of color who simply do not have the history of academic success and don't have any strong visual cues, it's simple. We don't let them walk in circles, folks. We don't let them walk in circles. How do we do that in real terms? Well, we do that by giving them strong and specific guidance. School administrators who are here, this costs money. There's a price tag attached to this. We must spend money on mentorship that is special and unique to reflect the special and unique students that come into our schools. From which all of us arise. Assume that these folks have no strong visual cues, and we have to hire professional paid mentors to increase in retention. It's not just a matter of getting them there. How many students are recruited to these schools and then left alone, left to the wolves? We can't do that. We have to spend money to create these structures to success for our students. Number 2, we embrace history. Good and bad, we have to dig and get the skeletons out that your school, your region, your nation has in its past. We can hide that stuff from before. You can't hide it anymore. People are gonna find it out. Have meaningful discussion about those topics regularly. I'll tell you just real quick, I was a courtroom attorney doing criminal defense, and oftentimes I suspect those students, those beautiful students who created revolution at the University of Missouri, they wanted their day in court. They wanted to talk about it, but they were pushed down so much, they said, nah, we're not even gonna entertain this conversation. And when I was in court, oftentimes my clients were guilty as hell. And they knew they were guilty as hell. But they wanted their day in court. They wanted to talk about it. They wanted meaningful conversation. So we should never, ever, ever run from these conversations about history. Finally, like going from slavery to sharecropping to restrictive covenants to zoning boards, the face of white supremacy is always changing. It's always changing, and that's true within our schools. And there are new and improved ways of teaching our kids that they have no value, and they have no worth, and we don't care about them. They're not worth protecting, and we have to always be vigilant, always be diligent to make sure that our children are aware of these changing technologies, these changing techniques of showing they have no value, and continue to embrace them and love them and show them that they do in fact have value. And we're going to in fact quantify that value by way of giving these strong supports to our students, these guides, these visual cues. History matters. It's not just Native people, it's everybody. And you can choose to acknowledge its importance, or you can wait till it shows up at your doorstep, like it did in Ferguson, like it did in Missouri, like it did in Baltimore. Or we can get ahead of the curve and talk about these things proactively. But in either situation, history absolutely matters. Thank you all very much.
Out of this remembering that. Thank you everyone for coming.